Welcome back to Max Easy Lessons. How are you doing, everyone? Do hope you have been working very hard. If you are new to the channel, thank you for stopping in. If you are returning, guess what? Thank you for continuing to support the channel. This is Max Easy Lessons, and today we are going to look at poetry. And the tricky part of poetry, yes, not just reading to understand the poems, but to understand the different poetic devices and the title and just about everything you need to know. Let's start with the title of the poem. Most poems carry a title, of course, and sometimes when we read the title of the poem, we will have a clear picture of what the whole poem is about. Sometimes some poets may choose to use the title ironically, or this means that as a kind of joke or a satirical comment. Now, we may not look exactly at all of the poems here in terms of the title and in terms of the content of this particular video, but we're just going to do a few. So let's continue. Let's consider the title of Elma Mitchell's poem, A Stone's Throw. In this poem, the whole idea is of the life of Jesus. A woman is caught in the act of adultery. She is brought to Jesus for him to pass sentence on her. Now, given the Pharisees permission to stone her to death as the law prescribed. The speaker in this poem is one of the Pharisees, and the Pharisees here seems to gain some form of pleasure because of the way they are rough handling the woman, and the merciful reaction of Jesus to the woman's sin is what tends to annoy the speaker intensely, because Jesus does not act in accordance to or with the Pharisees' actions. Now, the Pharisees much prefers to point the finger at another person's sinfulness than to confess his own shortcomings. In this case, the title becomes effective. Now, note, people, in many cases, the questions will ask you to comment on the effectiveness of a poetic device. So the title here becomes effective because it is a kind of pun with three different meanings. Literally, it is that it refers literally to the stones that the religious leaders want to throw at the woman in order to kill her. It also refers to the metaphorical saying that people who live in a glass house should not throw stones. In other words, the Pharisees are guilty of their own sins, and yet still they want to throw stones at the woman, and they should not, because they too have sinned. And thirdly, it reminds us of the situation where individuals are being made to become victims or scapegoats, and therefore they are just a stone's throw away. Now, in this context, there is different levels of meaning to the title. But when one looks at the words "a stone's throw," the whole title, then there is a message to be had for the whole poem. The speaker, when the poet writes, then he or she pretends to be someone else. And when we talk about the speaker or the persona, we are not talking directly about the person who has written the poem, but it's the person who has taken the lead in the poem. In Old Heed, for example, it's a speaker, the woman, who is supposed to be a part of the folktale and the legends. Some poems have most unusual speakers, such as an unborn baby. There is Miro in Sylvia Plath's poem, and in some cases there is a cat or whatever they choose, but the persona takes a different form from the actual poet. Please note that the poet is not the speaker. In some rare cases, yes, but you refer to the person in the poem who is conveying the message as the speaker or the persona. Many people will refer, yes, to the speaker as the persona. It is as if the poet has put on a mask then in order to assume a different personality. Let's look again at Elma Mitchell's poem. The speaker is not the gospel writer. The speaker is not Jesus. The speaker is not the woman. The speaker is not just an innocent bystander. The speaker in this case is in fact one of the men who demands that the woman be stoned to death for her adultery. It is interesting to note how Mitchell allows the man to reveal much about himself as he speaks of the events. We see that the man has become or is self-righteous. He is very prejudiced. He holds a scorn against Jesus, and even his hope, we see his hope that he believes and hopes and wishes for another instance to arise where he can put across his sadistic tendencies. None of this would have been shown if the reader had been a different speaker. Anybody else would have had a different impression of what was happening there and in relating the events. and we would not have had the ironic situation of a religious man who inadvertently shows us the fact that he is quite ungodly. Now let's look forward to the structure of the poem. Now there are different types of ways that the poems are presented. There is the ballad, the sonnet, and there is free verse. These are the most common ones. The ballad is a narrative with a 4-line stanza and a simple regular rhyming scheme. The sonnet stands as a poem of 14 lines that's either divided into 3 quatrains, and a quatrain, people, is a group of 4 lines each with a final couplet. And this is significant of the English or the Shakespearean sonnet. There is an octave and a sestet. It could be divided as such. 8 lines, a group of 8 lines, which represents the octave, and a group of 6 lines, which represents the sestet, and this is unique to the Italian or the Petrarchan sonnet. One example of the Petrarchan sonnet that you have studied here is the sonnet composed upon Westminster Bridge. Now finally, there is the free verse. This is a poem that does not make use of regular line lengths, regular standards, or stanza forms, and neither does it make use of end rhymes. For example, we have Once O He. This is an example of a free verse poem. Now, God's Grandeur is also a sonnet. Orchids is free verse. Theme for English B is free verse. The woman speaks to the man who has employed her son is also free verse. Now, if the poem that you are studying does not fit into any of these descriptions, simply refer to the poem as one that is different, yes, and it may not have stanzas or not, whether or not the stanzas are of regular length, and whether or not the rhyme is used. Always, though, look at the link between the structure and the meaning it is intended to convey, and ask yourself, what is the effectiveness of the choice of the structure? Now, the ballad form maintains a sing-song kind of pattern across the board. It gathers momentum as it goes along. If the poem has a surprise ending, then we become surprised because basically a ballad puts you to sleep, yes, with the easygoing rhythm of the stanza. But if there's a surprise ending at the end of the poem, then you would not see this. Wordsworth opted for the sonnet form to celebrate the loveliness of London in the early morning. Back then, sonnets were really popular. That's in the 16th century, as a form in which a young courtier would praise the beauty of the woman he loves. In this case, Wordsworth is praising the nature that he loves, the physical environment that he loves. The free verse form of a poem is easy for you to see it as a conversational tone. There is an absence of regular rhyme and rhythm, and this allows for a more hesitant, sometimes stumbling movement as the speaker begins to express the difficult or conflicting thoughts. In Old Hig, it is a free verse poem, and this is appropriate because the speaker is a folk figure who is speaking the dialect or the Creole. There is the use of rhetorical questions, and yes, this is one of the poetic devices, and we get the sense that she wants us to come into her thoughts. Each of these 3 irregular stanzas talks about a different phase of her argument, but still one can see that there is a structure of the thoughts. She moves from the known into her feelings and into her thoughts. Let's look at the rhyming under the sound of poetry. Poetry is intended to be read aloud, and of course you should make every effort to read your poems aloud in order to understand it. Now, we can hear rhymes in some cases, and the rhymes often stands at the end of the line. In many cases, the rhymes come at the end, and we call these end rhymes. Or there is internal rhymes where the rhyming pattern comes within the lines. Some rhymes are not going to sound identical. Yes. In The Woman Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son, there is a rhyming pattern in Tears and Prayers, and we call these half rhymes or near rhymes. Full rhymes will allow the reader to see a pattern and an order. In other words, they will allow us to see the effectiveness is that we see everything that is going according to plan. Half rhymes may suggest that the speaker is longing for order and harmony in life, but somehow the harmony is not within the grasp or the reach of the speaker. Now, Dulce et decorum est makes use of rhymes, but these are not for musical effects. Instead, Wilfred Owen uses the rhymes here to give us a greater insight into the importance of the poem's message. For example, sludge and trudge rhymes, boots and hoots, fumbling and stumbling. In this context, one could say that Owen underscores the horrors of war when he uses rhyme to create emphasis on the dreadful sounds and sights of the trench warfare. He even makes glory rhyme with mori to insist that there is no glory in war and that there is only death. Continuing, are you staying with me, people? I know this one is very long, but still, please stick around. Alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia. These are sound effects in poetry. Alliteration is when a consonant sound is repeated. Notice that there is sometimes the PH sounding as an F, and you can sound similar, and this can also sound similar to S. So in order to identify alliteration in a poem, you must first listen to the sound and not just look at the spelling. You have to be able to read it aloud, grasp the sound in this context in order to understand the alliteration that is present there. One person may argue, or people may say, that alliteration mimics the sound of whatever the poet is talking about. Quite often, too, alliteration works in much the same way as a highlighting pen. It draws your attention to specific words that the poet wants to bring across. Assonance is the other one. This is where there is a repetition of the same vowel sound, and again, in order to understand assonance in the poem, you have to listen to the sound. You cannot be distracted by the spelling of the word. You have to listen. Caught, mourn, port, these have similar vowel sounds. But if you look at these words, the spelling is going to be a little bit different. And finally, onomatopoeia. This is a poetic device that we use regularly in every day. For example, we have squelch, splash, pitter patter. In other words, onomatopoeia is basically sound words. You can see the sound, you can hear the sound, when you see the word. Now, examples of sound effects in your poem would be, one here is south. Brathwaite, he doesn't use his rhymes, but he uses alliteration throughout the poem. If you were asked what's a poetic device in south, you could always point to alliteration. Bright beaches, sound of the sea, sharp slanting sleet, waiting and watching, seashells shift, path made of pebbles. He also brings across assonance in life heaved and breathed in me. The phrase seashell shift could also be an example of onomatopoeia. There is also sound effects in West Indies, USA. The pilot crackles as it comes, the intercom. No, this is here to create a static sound. Then there is also through toughened tinted glass, the contrast, tantalize. Definitely alliteration. We see the highlighting of the security that is tightened and toughened and tinted. You know, there is a strong presence of security here in this poem. When you read the line, through toughened tinted glass, the contrast, tantalize. It's almost as if you're spitting out words in disgust, which is exactly the attitude that the poet wants to create. There is also polished Cadillacs shimming past, rastas with pushcart. The word shimming makes you think of a sensuous woman in a silky dress who is going through a crowd. She is moving in a sexy manner, that kind of thing. Yes, so there is kind of an exotic presence of shimming in this case. What is the effect of using the sound of poetry? When you come across these sounds and devices in a poem, always ask yourselves, what is the effect they are having? Soft words that are used for alliteration, for example, L, M, M, S, sh, etc., they create a soothing atmosphere. And I hope you're listening to this part carefully, because again, CXC will tend to ask you what is the effect of the poetic device. The soft alliterated sounds will create a soothing atmosphere, but the harsh ones that are noisier suggest activity or danger. The repeated long vowel sounds tend to produce a mournful effect, and the effect of onomatopoeia really will be determined by what it is mimicking. Let's go into the imagery of poetry, and we're going to look quickly at the simile, the metaphor, personification, and allusion. Now, there are four main important types of imagery here. The simile, yes, and just as I've listed before. In these cases, you're expected to compare two mental pictures. New ideas come to you about what the poet is communicating, and the reader, you as the reader, you are invited to imagine the two images or the pictures that are created here. In the case of a simile, the comparison will be triggered by the use of like or as. Let's take a quick look at Gabriel O'Carra's Once Upon a Time. He notes, "My laugh in the mirror shows only my teeth like a snake's bare fangs." And this one is a very popular one. That makes a lot of sense, right? Two pictures come to our mind when we think of this. We think of a man who is laughing for whatever reasons. But then when we go into a snake, we see something sinister, something almost evil. And so we think of the effect of the simile. The similarity between the two pictures is that we are both looking at the mouth of a person with teeth. But the biggest difference in this case is that the man who is smiling will appear to be innocent and happy. But this is transformed into something that is dangerous and frightening. The speaker is bemoaning the fact that he has grown older, he has learned the ways of the society, and as such, he has lost his innocence because he has changed to adjust to the sinister kind of behavior that could be associated with a snake. So the poet reminds us of the snake that long ago found its way into paradise, and so he wants us to understand how much the man has changed, how evil he had become, how sinful he had become. And in this case, we begin to feel, the effect here is that we begin to feel sorrowful and even anxious to know that such a corrupted person becomes the role model of a little child. Can we take West Indies, USA? All right, let's do it. West Indies, USA. The island of the Caribbean can be seen from an airplane. The simile is used here. Seem like dice tossed on a casino's base. Immediately we see the picture of dice landing in a casino. And I'm sure if you have never been in a casino before, and I'm thinking you have never been in a casino before, right? But if you have seen the movies, those tables where they throw the dice, it's normally for winning purposes. It's normally for the rich. People become rich from a casino, right? And so when we look at that image there, immediately there is a picture of the dice landing randomly on the green cloth of the casino table, and this reminds us of the random arrangement of islands on a map of the Caribbean. But there is also the gambling reference, where the speaker must see, or the whole idea is reinforced, that some islands are a gamble and some will become luckier than others. Puerto Rico, in particular, is the Dallas of the West Indies. And if you do know, and if you have read this poem, then Dallas, and if you have watched the series, there is a series on television, Netflix in particular, yes, that talks about Dallas. It's a rich state in the US, grounded in oil, and you know from oil is present, people, then there is going to be richness associated with the production of oil. The extended simile here is perfectly appropriate for the wealth and poverty and the uneasiness over the tight security that they have used to protect the rich from the poor. The metaphor, with a metaphor, the word like or as does not appear, yes, but there is a comparison. Now, what you need to remember is that it's not just a simple comparison. There has to be some amount of exaggeration within the comparison. All right, so in order to understand this, you have to think carefully, long and hard, yes, about the different uses of the metaphor and the simile and how these affect you when you have read them. In South once more, we see the use of the metaphor. The seagulls are flying off into the morning sky and they are carried on white sails. The imagery compares the seagulls with the ships that are sailing. The effect is to suggest that the limitless morning of possibilities are available to those who live on the islands, and it is of a different nature to the potential and the possibilities of the first world. Nature and not technology runs dominant in this territory. And quickly, personification. Similar to the metaphor and the simile, the personification compares, but it's a bit different. It is where you give human qualities to non-human objects or things or whatever it is you choose to say. All right? The effect is that you can see what is happening there more carefully. Wordsworth uses a similar personification. Sonnets composed upon Westminster Bridge. The city now doth like a garment wear, the beauty of the morning. The river glideth at its own sweet will. Dear God, the very houses seem asleep. Now within that context, the river is like a person. The river has a will of its own, and the houses are like people. They are asleep. Can you see the picture? In the early hours of the morning, yes, the houses are just there and they are almost asleep, and the city in this case wears a garment. This is definitely personification. Now, what effect does this personification have? Here we see Wordsworth trying to turn the city into a living person that is asleep and will be awakened by the morning sun. No longer can we see the city as an inanimate object, something without life, but we see the city as something to be loved, someone to be loved and admired, someone who is harmless and beautiful while they are asleep. But of course, we do know the contrast here, that during the Industrial Revolution, the factories come alive, there is sound, there is smoke, there is everything that's going around, and so the contrast is clear. Allusion in this case. Allusion is made when the speaker expresses his or her thoughts or chooses language in such a way that we are reminded of a similar situation outside of the poem. Biblical allusions are there, historical allusions are there, folk allusions are there, and of course there is in Mirror, there is that one that there is an allusion to the whole idea of Snow White in Mirror, Sylvia Plath's Mirror. There is allusion in Wilfred Owen's Dulce et Decorum Est. The Latin quotation comes at the last two lines of the poem. Now, this is actually supposed to mean sweet and fitting to die for one's native land, but the poet does not want us to see this. The poet wants us to see that there are harsh realities to death, there are harsh realities to the war, and that people really die badly in a war. And there is no glory. According to the poet, there is no glory in dying because of the way that you die. What is the effect in this case of the allusion? By invoking the attitude of an age long gone, the attitude that death on the battlefield is something glorious. Owen is able to present a shocking revolution based on his account of war. He shows us the appalling, inglorious reality that is associated really with war. It's not a fairy tale. For Owen, who has experienced war, the whole idea of war is not a fairy tale. We find ourselves we compare this with the horrific realities of a modern warfare. And one could agree with Owen that war is not something good. When you go to that front line, you are exposed to poisonous gas, you are exposed to guns, you are exposed to death. And as a supporting soldier, if you are not the one who dies then you would see the horrors of it all. He wants us to realize that the old idea of glory and honor is just a part of an old lie. And we can become angry. One of the effects is that we become angry that the young men and women are drawn into war because they believe in the lies that are told about war, that war is glorious and that you come back with honor and that you will have a good time over. No, you don't have a good time in war. What happens is that there are gruesome realities of war and there are gruesome realities of the death that comes with war. Okay, people, are you still here? Please stay tuned because this one is really very tricky. This one is a tricky one and it is going to come. All right. So other poetic devices here include diction, tone and mood, repetition, symbol, paradox, irony, and also pun. I'm going to try to go as quickly as I can right here. All right. So diction. When we're discussing diction, we could be talking about the words that the poet chooses to use. In West Indies, USA again, Stuart Brown wants to highlight the contrast between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots in San Juan. And across the Caribbean, those who are rich, those who are poor. And so he takes just about 4 islands and he compares what is going on here. He suggests that the wealth of some folk, by using diction associated with a technologically developed society. He talks about the tough and the tinted glass of the vehicle, the shimmering tarmac, the condominiums that are owned by rich people, yes, and the polished Cadillacs as well. And on the other hand, he speaks about the galvanized shanties, the pushcart, that suggests that there is a wide gap between those who are rich and those who are poor. In Dulce et Decorum Est once more, Owen makes use of carefully selected diction as he tries to create a sense of the panic and confusion of the soldiers who are fumbling, stumbling, floundering, and of course the death throes of the soldiers who has to breathe in the poison gas. He speaks to plunges, guttering, choking, drowning. All these words are intended to draw sympathy and empathy from the persons who are reading the poem. Straight into tone and mood. When you say something, you tend to use a tone of voice. Now, either your tone of voice is sincere of praise, or it can be sarcastic. It can be, which creates a mockery. It can be just about anything. It's the tone of voice that a person presents. Whatever feeling the person is trying to convey, they will bring across that tone. In Dulce et Decorum Est, the speaker's tone is one of horror, distress, and anger. He is upset. His stomach is sick by what he has seen at the front. Now, when we look at Test Match Sabina Park, this is in contrast to the speaker in Dulce et Decorum Est. Stuart Brown in Test Match Sabina Park comes across as having a playful tone. He struts into the cricket ground. He is confident. He knows that the British will win, but he has to leave blushing with embarrassment because he recognizes that the West Indian crickets of the idols, of his idols, they have got a point indeed. In each case, let's talk about the effect of the tone of the speaker. In The Woman Who Speaks to the Man Who Has Employed Her Son, the woman says of her child's father that he was fair-minded. He treated all his children with equal and unbiased indifference. Now, when I read this poem, this was my favorite part of it. This was definitely my favorite part of it when I read it years ago. He treats them with equal and unbiased indifference. Here, the tone is largely sarcastic, but there is some kind of twisted humor to what is there. As you can see, you will need more than one adjective to describe the tone of the poem. Do not limit yourself to just using one. Explain what you are saying so that your marker will know exactly what you are saying. Similarly, with mood, you may need several adjectives. Now, you have to remember that the mood created in the poem may change from one stanza to the next. You may not have one mood constant throughout the poem, in other words. For example, let's go back to South. He creates a mood. Kamal Brathwaite creates a mood of nostalgia when the speaker talks about his island. He longs to go home, and so he is nostalgic. And then, of course, there is joy and hope because he now sees his island home. He sees the beach and the urchins playing there. In contrast, though, in this same poem, there is a mood of bitterness and oppression as the speaker contemplates what he has gone through his journey to the northern lands and the way that these people in the north have historically oppressed the people of the island. In other words, the mood and the tone are created by the diction, the imagery, and even the rhyme and rhythm that is used by the poet. Repetition, and I'm going as fast as I can here, people. Repetition occurs in a poem. When this happens, it is not just for emphasis alone. All right, and normally we think that repetition is for emphasis, but occurs once upon a time. There is a repetition of the phrase once upon a time. Now, by using this traditional opening for children's stories, he suggests that at the onset, he was innocent as a child, as children are, and he lived in a fairy tale land. But as he grew older, there is a repetition that increases our sense of his sorrow and regret that he is no longer able to think about or to live in that past where people were innocent and people did things that were innocent. In Dreaming Black Boy, the persona repeats the words, I wish. We now begin to feel, because of the repetition of I wish, we see how vulnerable and childlike he is, almost like a fairy tale in many ways, and how tragic it is that his reasonable hopes for the future are wishes that will probably never come true. All right, so we are into symbol. A useful definition of a symbol is that a symbol is itself, and it also points to a meaning outside of itself. In South, the speaker is from the Caribbean. He sees himself as having been born of the ocean. He believes that the people from the north can be associated with rivers. Of course, there are a few real rivers in the Caribbean islands that will be equal to the vast river of the North America and Europe. So the river itself in the poem literally means a river. But there is more to a river than one that meets the eye. The river symbolizes a longing an endeavor, a purpose, and a progress. The speaker recognizes that the river quality has led Europe to conquer and colonize other territories, which brings pain and sorrow to the peaceful people. In theme for English B, the college is literally on the hill above Harlem, but the hill also symbolizes something else. It means that the black students who lived in Harlem would have had a rough time trying to climb up to that college, and that they would never belong in the privileged white world, but they will always have to go back down that hill into poverty and the stigma of Harlem. It also symbolizes the fact that the rich could also afford airspace, so they could afford to be on the hill. They could afford any lifestyle that elevates them above the people who are poor. The hill represents elevation in many ways. White people have always been seen as the elevated bunch, and the black people have been seen as the ones who stand at the bottom of the hill. Paradox, anybody? Let's go with paradox. Poetry, like life, is full of paradox. The fact that being in love is agony and ecstasy, for example, is a paradox. It's good and it's bad, so therefore it becomes a paradox. The freedom of movement can be restricted in many ways. No, the paradox is one that is not too hard to understand, yes, but in many cases, Martin Carter's This Is the Dark Time, My Love brings across the paradox to make it easy. The season of oppression, the festival of guns, the carnival of misery. These are all opposing thoughts that are presented as one idea. So there is the good and the bad involved in the paradox. Irony, and I'm going quickly here, I'm chopping things up, people. The examples of paradox that you have just looked at can be ironic. In fact, paradox is also a type of irony. And irony happens when the opposite of what you expect. That is what happens. In West Indies, USA, the speaker talks about the Statue of Liberty in the context that it represents the United States and the land of the free, where poor people are welcomed. And in this context, they are allowed to become better. But then he also draws our attention to the fact that when you go to Puerto Rico, which is supposed to be representative of the land of the free and the home of the brave, yes, it's not so, because there is a tightened sense of security there. And of course, there is a pilot that reminds you that you have to stay on the plane. I repeat, stay on the plane. This is an additional ironic twist, and the speaker clearly does not like San Juan as he thought he would. He doesn't want to remain there. And yet the American authorities would seem that everybody on board would want to be there. I imagine the speaker merely wanted to understand that Puerto Rico stood as a part of the United States and that it should have been a rich territory. In a stone's throw, we expect the Pharisees to be a godly man because he wants to obey the law, right? But realistically, he is a sadist. He is lustful and he wants to be cruel and harsh to the woman. When we talk about the pun, many words have more than one meaning, and sometimes the writer will exploit the slipperiness of the words that is created with the puns. A couple of puns can be found in the poem Test Match Savannah Park. There are two English cricketers here, and they are of a former generation where these were boycott and a miss. Now, if you want to boycott something, you go against it, right? And a miss is when you miss a score. Isn't that so? So the two Test cricketers were also, their surnames are Boycott and Amiss. Now, to boycott something, as I said before, it means to abstain from using or buying something, and to amiss means out of the correct order. Stuart Brown puns on these two names in these lines to comment on how miserably England was performing at the wicket. England boycotting excitement bravely, something badly amiss. Now, there goes the pun. The effect, of course, is to create humor or at least force one to smile in some cases. So everyone, I honestly could not do all 20 of them in terms of their poetic devices, but I genuinely and I truly do hope, for my students' sake and for your sakes, people, yes, I do hope that the poems that I have looked at here with their poetic devices are the ones that actually come on the exam paper. And I'm going to try to do as many poems as I can, yes, and some more questions by tonight and tomorrow. So keep your bell buttons on. I know I'm cutting it very, very close. Yes, I am. But please try to stay tuned to the channel and let's see what happens for tonight and tomorrow. Okay? Thank you so much for coming by, and I do wish you all the very, very best in your exams.